Hi, I'm Ushma Neal with the Journal of Clinical Investigation, here with a short video of some of the best clips in our series of Conversations with Giants in Medicine. These are stories of partnership, of persistence, of the joy of discovery. There's stories in here about finding your way, some scientific silliness, about the role of women in science, and also of communication. At the end, I feature my very favorite story. It's sort of like choosing from among your children. I've heard so many fascinating stories over the last 5 years, but stay tuned till the end to hear a really great story from Bruce Alberts.
I often like to tell the story about this partnership, that there's a remarkable mind meld between the two of you. So, as you know, we find ourselves together at meetings, conferences, scientific advisory board meetings. Sometimes I'm with Joe, sometimes I'm with Mike, sometimes we're all together. But I have found, without exception, if I'm with Joe and I tell him something, I don't care how trivial it is, it could be a scientific fact, it could be a piece of scientific gossip, the next time I see Mike, he knows it. Okay, and this is without exception. And there aren't enough hours in the day for Joe to have related everything I told him to Mike, and vice versa. Yeah. So how does that work?
Let me just say again, it's not just gossip. I come in every morning, and Joe gives me a complete digest of the scientific literature from the night before. Okay, I mean I have the most privileged existence because I don't have to read anything.
It's amazing. And everything in the New York Times. I have had the experience on many occasions of being with Joe at a meeting, and we come down like at 7 a.m. To catch the bus to wherever we're going. And he says, "Have you seen this story? Have you seen that?" I said, "No, where did you read it?" He says, "In the Times." I said, "How did you get the Times this early?" But he just kind of smiles.
He tries to get it. But you get off a plane with him, okay? Mm-hmm. I'm telling stories about Joe, but if you get off a plane with him and you're walking through the concourse, and I'm worried about the taxi or picking up my luggage or whatever, he makes a beeline for the newsstand just in case there's something new out there that he can read. And then the internet was invented for him. There's no question that Al Gore invented the internet for Joe Goldstein. It's just two Southerners, obviously.
Joe is the ultimate multitasker. I've had on many occasions the following experience. We'll be sitting at a scientific advisory board meeting for a company, and a very complicated set of slides is being shown. I'm trying my best to focus all my attention on it. Joe's busy on the internet, sitting next to me. He's got his computer out or his iPad, and he's flicking back and forth between 4 stories and this and that. Then he's doing an email. And I say, he's not paying any attention at all. Finally, they get to the end. He puts up his hand. He asks the most incisive question. I said, how is this possible? I mean, how can he operate on so many levels together? Kind of interesting.
So I think all of us, the 3 of us, are lucky that the internet wasn't invented, that Al Gore didn't come along in our formative years, because we would have never been able to focus. Because I think you've even given a talk on focus.
Right.
It probably is the most single important thing for a young
scientist is to focus.
Focus and really try to solve one problem at a time.
You're right, Joe. I mean, this is a very interesting issue. If you look at our 3 careers, one thing that we have in common is this element of focus. I often tell people that you could take most of the experiments going on in my laboratory right now, and if you went back to the experiment that led to that, and then the one that led to that, and the one that led to that, you could go back to the day I opened my lab without any real jump. In other words, I've pursued a line of research. Granted, it's ramified and you can't follow all the direction, but we haven't really jumped. I think the same is sort of true of your career.
The way I say it is that we never jump with 2 feet. We always keep 1 foot on solid ground. If we're exploring new areas, we keep 1 foot on solid ground. So all of our work has really stemmed around cholesterol, lipids in general.
Right.
And it's nice because, a lot of smart people aren't interested in lipids, so it makes it easier for us.
And the way he's smarter than me is the following. He's intuitive. Maybe it's my background, but I'm kind of bookish. So when we're considering a new project or considering ways to do something, my approach is to read all the literature for the last 50 years and try to integrate what's known and what's not known and come to some sort of decision about what's optimal to do. Ken just intuits a decision, has incredible intuition, much better than mine, about what's important. And he's unfortunately usually right, and I hate to say that on camera, but it's the truth. So, you know, those two kinds of things, intuition plus searches of the literature, bring together and make the decisions we jointly make after fist fighting, etc. Usually pretty reasonable.
Yeah, I think Bert's being a bit modest. When he says read the literature, he is the literature. He is like Google on legs. I mean, it's just amazing. And he couples that with an incredibly rigorous logical and thought process. Incredibly rigorous logic, and that really is really good for the environment, good for our trainees, and good for thinking things through and making sure that we understand a problem in its entirety.
Could you interview us every day? Because this is not what he usually says.
So we really focused a lot on measuring impact, creating vehicles for this, setting up an Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, a health metrics network, collaborating with the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation and so on, and really trying to get a handle on whether we were moving the needle or not. And lastly, I would say partnership. There's an old African adage that if you want to go fast, travel alone. If you want to go far, travel together. And in the world of global health, there are lots of players. There's the WHO, UNICEF, Global Fund, Gavi, and so forth. And how we create a collaborative network to accomplish common goal is something that I think the Gates Foundation tried to do, and that's had a very positive impact. So
there was a moment when you were facing so much uncertainty about the nature of your research that it was hard to get funding. So you were finishing your clinical training with 3 small children. You had to take a trip and you had to spend the night either in a movie theater or on a park bench. And on one occasion you had to smuggle a lab rabbit out of your lab at Northwestern in order to...
Oh, those were true stories.
So how did you weather that period of uncertainty and keep persevering in what must have been just an undaunting and difficult task to accomplish?
I don't know that I gave it the kind of deep thought that that you're implying I should have had, but somehow I thought that everything was going to turn out all right. But I think that the greatest source of anxiety was not so practical as all that. I didn't know for sure what to do, and so I described in one of these little things that were prepared for the Lasker Prize that that I referred to myself at one time as a missile searching for a trajectory. I was bursting with energy. I really wanted to do something that wasn't conventional, wasn't going to be bread and butter surgery as a means of making money, but I wanted to do something important that would have a life of its own, that would endure.
So how did you end up getting recruited to UT Southwestern, and what did you make of the place when you first arrived?
Well, I was very happy at Yale, but you must remember that at that time there were very few medical schools of a high academic type in the United States. Medical schools were just being developed all over the country, but they were new. One of the older and more established schools was Yale. And the section in the Department of Medicine where I was in was very crowded. Almost the entire Department of Medicine consisted of the metabolic division. I was very happy there. They treated me very well, but it was a crowded place. And when I received an offer from Dr. Burnett, Charles Burnett, who had just accepted an appointment as chairman at Southwestern, I decided to take it. I was very naive at the time. I never looked at the institution. I never visited. And when I came to Dallas, it was quite a shock.
I read from your biography that you turned up to the corner that they had indicated and you weren't sure whether or not that was actually what the school was.
Well, when I arrived in Dallas in my car, accompanied by my daughter and my wife, I inquired at a filling station where the medical school was because I wanted to see it. I hadn't visited before. And I drove down where he indicated, and all I saw was a bunch of broken down shacks and garbage. So I thought that I had missed the school, and I returned to the filling station and indicated to the attendant that I went where he instructed me, but all I saw was garbage and shacks. And he said, "That's it. It's the medical school."
Did you regret the choice at that point, or did you consider it a challenge?
Life being what it is, I nodded, and we went to an overnight hotel to face the future.
During this 3-year period between when you wrote that notebook page for the assay for gene placement and when you got that blue bacteriophage that showed that you actually had made it work, those were some dark days. Maybe you had a student or two who left, but you strike me as being incredibly persistent.
Well, I think I was persistent because I had people helping me at the time. I had a graduate student who helped me, but she decided that it was too risky and quit. And then we had a time when we realized that we had the possibility of contamination with a bacteriophage already made, and people got very despondent about it, and I was a bit despondent about it. And then I went away with my flying friends and we went sailing, and I came back and said, I'm going to start again. And so I started again and changed the methods and made it work. So you have ups and downs. There were definitely downs, but you might say persistent, and keeping good notes, because there was part of the assay that meant getting a large number of bacteriophages, which make little pinholes in a bacterial plate. And for some reason or other that I didn't understand, my plaques got smaller and smaller, so I had to hold up we're using big dishes, not little tiny petri dishes, big dishes, hold it up to this evening sun, you might say, to see them. And I couldn't understand why it wasn't working anymore. And then I thought, well, go back and look at when it was working and what did you do different. And I went back there and I found a little tiny note in bottom right-hand corner of the page where it last worked, saying I had thought that the bacteria that I was using to grow the bacteriophages had been made on Friday, and this was Monday. I think I better freshen them up. So the little note says freshen them up by diluting them and letting them grow. And so they went back into growth instead of being what we call a stationary phase. And when they were growing exponentially, it turned out they made big plaque. So I went back to my bench and changed growing the bacteria to growing them freshly. It worked again. And all because of a little note in the corner of my notebook.
I had arrived on an Air France flight, got home around 4:30 and the phone was ringing. I said, how long have you been calling? She said, constantly. So she kept on calling, hoping that the minute I'll get in, I will pick up the phone. And I said, and the kids were young and so on. I said, well, you want to just bring your notebooks and come? And she did. And we sat down and I looked at the data and I just had chills, down my spine. I couldn't believe it because I've had so many red herrings. I've told you about, I had many chromosomal abnormalities where I would be excited, clone the locus, there's nothing there. I even had mutations that are null allele, but then I'll discover them in the father. So I know that this couldn't be causing Rett. So you've had so many, failures, along the way after 16 years. It's going to be very tough for this to happen. And you see now in patient after patient that there is a null mutation, a mutation really inactivating, and you don't see it in her parents. So this was like, she showed me half a dozen right away, so I knew this must be it.
I got in a lot of trouble right from my very first assay because I had just come from the Naval Blood Research Laboratory where I knew how to count cells better than anybody on Earth because that's what we did all day long. And I grew up in a family where my mother was morbidly fearful of radiation. So when we got, first of all, we were never allowed to have a color TV because it gave off too much radiation. But we had a black and white TV, and my mother, every time we moved, put a line 6 feet away, and we weren't allowed to get any closer to that because she was worried that we, my sister and I, as kids, would get too much radiation. So I always thought you should limit the radiation, and so I said, well, I know how to count cells, so instead of adding the tritiated thymidine, which is radiation, I'll just count the cells and how many there are between day 3 and day 4.
So I happened to know that one of the postdocs had labeled a probe that was used for the northern blot that showed expression in fat. Another had made blots anticipating this moment of RNAs from mutant and wild type animals, and so I went in that night after having called everyone and I was unable to reach them, so I set up the blot myself and developed it late one night or early one morning on a Sunday.
What was that moment like of understanding that you had actually narrowed it down?
It was pretty frickin' awesome. And it was really one of the great moments of my life.
So later, the results from that trial showed a 5-month increase in survival. And the FDA in 2004 approved the use of Avastin for renal cell carcinoma and colorectal carcinoma. So what was your feeling on the day you got the news that it was approved? Did you have champagne? Was there a big party? Did you have a parade on the Genentech grounds?
I don't think so. I remember actually I learned the news from actually Art Levinson, our CEO. He was so kind, to call me. I was actually in Siena, doing like a week of lecture in this lovely city in Tuscany. I remember I drank a whole bottle of Chianti after I had this news.
Over the years, you've written books and essays about particularly inspirational patients.
Yeah.
And concurrently your path of discovery through that. And in an essay you wrote recently, there was a phrase that I starred next to it as I was reading it, because it was particularly indicative of your brash, witty, eloquent, and very memorable style, and it reads as this: 4 decades ago, when I was a brash 40-year-old physician, I pledged to his parents that I would not rest until he was on a course that would permit him to outlive me. In retrospect, that promise was the product of hubris or suicidal ideation. You have such a way with words.
Yeah. Well, that's Khalid. And I did write a book about Khalid when he reached his 30th birthday. And now he's in his 50s. And he's one of the most successful restaurateurs in Washington. And, go to Sushi Co. in Chevy Chase. It's the best restaurant, absolutely wonderful. Anyway, Khalid came as this little sick 6-year-old with a hemoglobin of 1.5 and somehow struggling along. And there was something about that boy, I just felt he represents everything I want to do. I know I can't fix him the way he should be fixed. I can't do gene therapy, although that's coming now. But I can do something. I can fix him as best I can. And I can use every technique that I've got to do it. And I have seen this boy respond to all of that. The book describes the field and him. And he's a symbol to me. In fact, I'm having an 85th birthday party, and he's coming, and he's going to talk to the group about what it is to be a patient and what modern medicine has done for him. And it has. We've used every trick in the book to get this guy viable. And the pharmaceutical industry has done their thing. He's alive because of oral iron chelators. We didn't have those when we started. So it is a great story. There has been a tremendous amount of growth in our field. And in every field, we're moving. And he really represents it. And yes, it was the idea that he was going to live till be his 50s was hubris. But there he is. We did it.
I would say, I would characterize myself up to this point as a dilettante. I did a lot of things. Like I told you in college, I interested in everything, did a lot of different things. And my husband also made me get more serious about life. There was somebody at Columbia who offered us to go be the doctors on a cruise ship that was going to go around the world. And I thought, you know, why don't we take a year off? Let's do that, see the world. And my husband goes, no, you know, let's get serious. What are you going to do? What do you know, think about? But anyways, but Dr. Sullivan, when I was chief resident, he selected me to be chief resident. And when I was chief resident, he asked me what I was going to do. And even at that stage, I really wasn't sure. I knew that I liked endocrinology. That was driven by another person who you've interviewed here, Gene Wilson. I could tell you about that later. But so I liked endocrinology, so I told him I thought I would do endocrinology, and I knew I would have a spot there if I wanted to do endocrinology. And he said, he just shook his head. He said, oh yes, I said I wanted to do endocrinology and I would practice. He goes, no, that's not for you. I said, what are you talking about? He said, no, it will never sustain you. That'll be 5 years. 5 years you'll be looking for something else to do. And I was a little baffled. He said, I really think you should go into a laboratory. To a laboratory? And he said, yes. And what was interesting was, at that time, it's not so much the case now, but almost everybody who was an attending on the internal medicine wards had a laboratory and did laboratory science. And they would talk, you know, when we would have free time and have gone over all of our cases, when they were attending on the wards, they would talk about their science. I loved it. I loved hearing about it. And the people that I enjoyed the most as physicians were the people that were the scientists. I felt an affinity for the way that they thought, the way that they handled problems, the kinds of things that they thought interesting, I found interesting. So so when he said it, there was a part of me that kind of thought, well, you know, maybe he's got something there. And then he said, and I think you should go into the Brown and Goldstein laboratory. And my first thought was, lipoproteins. Oh no, so boring. And that just tells you how little I understood about science.
So when in this trajectory did you abandon medical school or abandon being a pre-med major and decide to do a PhD?
I think it was my freshman year when I was taking organic chemistry, and I don't want to say this incorrectly, but organic chemistry can be beautiful if you get into it. But the way it was taught, the particular course that I had was just memorize and regurgitate, memorize and regurgitate. And I think they intended the course to really be the cutting course. That if you couldn't take it, then you shouldn't be a doctor, and it was taught that way. And so that was one thing I really regret, that I missed what could have been, you know, the beauty of organic chemistry.
It's the only class I ever got a C in as well, so I feel you.
Yeah, well, I did worse.
What's your nickname? Can we call you Frankie?
Please don't. I'm still Francis. I will admit that when I was a little kid, this is hard to say, my mom and dad called me not Frankie, but Francie, and I am so glad that that one disappeared by my strong insistence by about the age of 10, although I still encounter people who knew me as a very small child who slip up, and I have to give them quite a strong talking to about how that should never escape their lips. I'm just Francis.
Do you have a favorite color?
I think the one I'm wearing. My wife says I look best in blue, so.
Well, and so then I asked your trainees this. They both said that you liked blue, but they also said they had no idea if your hair has ever had color. Were you born with white hair? I've known you for 15 years, and I've always known you with this shock of white hair.
I had dark brown hair.
No.
Dark brown curly hair until my early 20s, then it started to go. I think this is the Norwegian side of my family. My father's parents were white, and so I have that Norwegian blood, but I guess most people don't know me like that.
I think you would be kind of unrecognizable, honestly. All right, do you
I thought about coloring it, but I thought people might notice.
Then in 2010, you were knighted by Queen Elizabeth II. What was that process like? Do you have a sword? Did you get a cape? Did they give you a white horse as well?
No, you don't get it. They don't give you anything. But in fact, it's quite funny. I mean, in my the Queen is now mid-80s, so now it's nearly always done by Prince Charles. And before the ceremony, they sort of write to you and ask some interesting questions. And one is, can you kneel? Okay. And then, can you get up? These are interesting questions, but if you look at the average age of people getting knighthoods, it's not entirely. But it was a very nice ceremony at Buckingham Palace. There were, you know, they give probably about 24 knighthoods a year, and so it's broken up.
Now you've mentioned Congo, Zim and Zam and Cuba. You must have quite the passport.
Well, actually, someone at the Smithsonian apparently stole my passport. The last one, it was one of these thick ones with all kinds of visas. So I have a new one. It's filling up fast.
What is one of your favorite adventures? North Korea, Cuba?
Well, you know, they're interesting places to go. I think going to North Korea is often a little grim. It's cold, they don't heat the buildings. It's interesting, of course. Cuba, that's fascinating.
You've met Fidel Castro.
Not only that, I've danced to the Buena Vista Social Club. It's interesting. I guess there are multiple places that I enjoy. I like the places I visit, Lebanon, Tunisia. Congo was fascinating. So there's no one place I would prefer over all the others. I like going back to Norway, where our family is from. Yeah, the people I've met have been really, really very interesting. Castro may be the most interesting.
Now you used your share of the winnings to endow a prize in the name of your mother, the Perlmeister Green Guard Award for Women in Science. Yes. Can you tell me why you decided to use your honorarium for that prize?
I had seen a lot of discrimination against women. When I grew up, it was pretty much universally accepted that women were inferior by both men and women. It's hard to believe now, but almost everybody I knew thought men were smarter than women. And it took a long time and a lot of fighting by a lot of courageous women and some supportive men to put that idea to rest. And having seen all this discrimination, I thought it would be nice to do something to help champion these women who are still struggling and still are today. It's incomparably better than it was, but there's still a lot of discrimination. So that's why I did that.
I've often re-quoted you saying, I've got a brain and a uterus and I use them both.
Now that's not my quote, you know.
No?
That's Patricia Schroeder.
Okay.
I always, it's Patricia Schroeder, the congresswoman from Colorado.
Well, it's still an excellent quote.
It is an excellent quote. I love it. I use it all the time. And she certainly did both. I think we have to you have to put your money where your mouth is when it comes to women, right? You need support, and I've spent a lot of time during my career mentoring women. And you need intellectual support, as you do for any mentee you have. You also need to have emotional support, because women really tend to be less self-confident than men. And that includes all of us.
Do you have a favorite Latin or Greek phrase? Can you still speak any of it? Do you remember any of it?
Well, I have. My favorite Latin one is one I have to deal with every day as director of NIAID, and that is illegitimi non carborundum, which translates, don't let the bastards wear you down.
Would you ever run for public office?
That's funny. No. That's a question I've never been asked, and I won't even ask you why you asked it, but no, the answer is I could never even imagine that. I can't imagine not being a scientist.
You've been called the bacteria whisperer by Neil deGrasse Tyson. I noted you got a standing ovation at your 2009 TED Talk, so you clearly, and even just through this interview, you clearly excel at making complicated scientific concepts easy to digest and understand.
I work on communication. It would be bad if I couldn't talk about it, right? Right?
Well, I mean, so tell me what you think. Would you ever consider a second career as a pundit?
Right. So I've actually, okay, so this would be something I probably never said out loud before. I've actually thought about that. I've thought about a number of, these are called midlife crises, I guess, right? And I am old enough to have those. I've thought about a number of these second careers, right? Like, what does it mean when it's the end of my life? You know, what, right? I have this legacy, I already know that, of these students and postdocs, right? I am so happy about that. It has been an honor and a privilege and a joy, right? And so that sort of happened, right? And so then you sort of ask yourself, are you going to find, the next molecule, the next, circuit, right? Or would that be enough, right? Or do you want to just do something else? That's what you're asking me. And so I've sort of dabbled in these things, right? And I do have this passion, like we're just talking about with this Pure. I have this passion for this country especially, which is that I worry so much, why do people hate science? Why do they think it's too hard to learn? Why do they think it's boring? And why do they think it's bad? And that's part of it. And then the other part is, I do science because the taxpayers say I can, right? And so this idea that if people don't vote, and I mean for basic science, for letting a young woman back then working on a glow-in-the-dark bacteria that nobody, not she, not anyone else, could ever even imagine might make an antibiotic or a coating so you don't get a biofilm when you get an intubation device or a catheter or a paint or whatever is going to come from these sort of applied quorum sensing strategies, right? I did not have that in my mind then. I have some of it in my mind now, right? Like there has to be a place in this country to let that person, just driven by her curiosity, let it go where it's going to go, right? And so my worry is that the next young person doesn't get the shot that I got, because this country doesn't understand that there's nothing to apply to make our lives better unless some scientist works on the basic part of it. And I mean that for everything, for engineering, for technology, for biology, for all of it.
So you have a real way with words, and I compiled, based on reading some of the things about you, some of my most the things that entertained me the most about your writing. Dress British, think Yiddish.
Most of these things that are attributed to me, I picked up from other people and pass them on. You kind of gather them, and over the years, and I like that little thing. I didn't make these things up.
Okay, well, I think some of them you did, because one of them I lifted from your presidential address when you were ASCI president, which was, don't worry if you have to give an after cocktails or after dinner talk. A third of the audience is just falling asleep, a third of the audience is just waking up, and a third is engaging in private fantasies that they wouldn't want to discuss with anyone.
That, I'm not sure whether I made it up or not, but I've known it for years. Yeah, but they actually said private sexual fantasies. But anyhow, I'd let that out of that.
So at this point, you are a well-published, well-known author. You've written this textbook. You start getting roped into more and more committee work, like chairing the committee on mapping and sequencing the human genome. And then later asked to be the president of the National Academies of Sciences. So your science is going so well. How do you manage to step away from the lab to take on more of these policy roles? And why did you?
So it really started with a 1985 editorial I wrote for Cell after visiting Paris, where my friend Mark Kirshner was on sabbatical, and seeing the difference between French bread in small bakeries and the kind of junky bread I was eating in America, which was Wonder Bread or something. So I wrote this editorial in Biology, Small Science is Good Science, talking about labs of 10 people or less, and explained why. And this editorial in Cell was then attacked viciously by subsequent editorials by other people. One of them said, if Bruce Alberts thinks that he should have a small enough lab so that he could occasionally do experiments, that's what I said in my article, so I could understand the technical aspects of advising students. If Bruce Alberts thinks that, then he should be paid like a technician. This is the quote I remember. Anyway, so I got known as the small science guy. Now, then the Genome Project was incubated. I had nothing to do with it. For arguments, I was too busy to pay attention. But most biologists were against it because it was big science. So they already had the Genome Committee set up. It was Watson and Sidney Brenner, all these, Dan Nathans, all these fantastic people. Half of them thought there should definitely be a genome project, and many of the most severe critics were already on it as well. Shirley Tillman, for example, David Botstein. It was a great committee. And so somebody at the Academy got the idea they needed somebody neutral, that was me because I hadn't even thought about it, to be the chair. And I was just astonished to get this call to be the chair. I said, why me? I haven't thought about it. And they said, that's why we want you. But really they also wanted me because I had written a small science editorial, so that if the committee came out with a strategy to go forward with a project, it wouldn't look like it was biased from the start by people who believed in big science. So in retrospect, if I hadn't written that 1985 editorial, I'd still be in the lab probably.
So you should blame Mark Kirshner and Parisian bread.
Yes.
That's the reason we have a genome.
You could thank baguettes for this.